So, let me just go off on another tangent, Dr. Hashmi Javad, and ask you about the person of Jesus. Of course, with regards to the virgin birth of Jesus, which is something that believing Christians accept, and for the last 1400 years, as far as the Islamic tradition goes, that's also something that the Quran seems to allude to, that Jesus was born miraculously. But if I were to ask you this question as an Islamic modernist, as a critical historical scholar, and as a believing Muslim, how do you reconcile the two, and what would be your best guess as to what the Quran is actually trying to say?
Okay, so this is a really heavy question that you've asked me. And so I have to be very cautious because there are going to be a bunch of trolls who are going to come attack me after this. So, what I would say is this question, really the question that you're asking, I think the deeper question is, what do we do about miracles?
Mm.
So, in the historical critical method, you pretty much don't accept miracles, to be honest. I mean, now some historical critical scholars are going to be like, no, 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 we just bracket those off. But in reality, I do think that we don't really believe in miracles when you're taking the historical critical approach. And for me, that hasn't been a problem because of the fact that I was deeply influenced by the classical Islamic philosophers who also did not believe in miracles, at least in the way of miracles that we think about today, which is a break in the natural law. Um, and the reason why they didn't believe in that is because they believed that God is the one who created those laws, or those laws came out of God. They had an emanationist model of the creation of the universe, and those laws were created by God in that sense. And why would God create those set of laws and then go violate those laws? I mean, he himself is the one who created those laws. And there's certain Quranic verses that they would look at too, perhaps like there's no change in the sunnah of God. But so they don't believe in miracles from that perspective. Now, what they would do is they would naturalize or allegorize
Right.
miracle stories in the Quran.
Mhm.
Now, as you also know, the Islamic modernists of the 19th century, starting with Sayyid Ahmed Khan, Sir Sayyid, he often would naturalize many of the Quranic miracles. Personally, and this you see this also in liberal theology when it comes to Christianity. So initially, liberal theologians started naturalizing um, the miracles in the Bible. So, for example, how did Jesus walk on water? No, actually, he didn't walk on water.
Mm.
It was quite shallow, and it appeared to people that he walked on water.
Yeah.
Personally, I find the naturalization approach to be less than satisfying or convincing. Um, and that's what Circea did. I think allegorizing is probably the better approach to go. And by allegorizing, I mean specifically understanding that the Quran can use stories that have legendary aspects to them
Mm.
for specific theological ends in mind. So
Yeah.
the Quran, I say, is not a book of science nor of history.
Mm.
It's conveying stories of the past for a specific theological purpose in mind. So when the Quran is talking about Jesus, the Quran is less interested in the historical Jesus and more interested in the theological Jesus or the theological Christ. Okay. And it's engaged in theology. And so the Quran is responding to the polemic against Jesus
Mm.
by the Talmud and by certain Jewish persons or thinkers,
Mm.
and also trying to match. It's more sympathetic to the Christian side or the Christian perspective, while at the same time disagreeing with the idea that Jesus is a divine, like one of the part of the Trinity. So the Quran is balancing this act, and so when it's re-narrativizing stories, it's doing that with those theological ends in mind. From that perspective, the Quran embraces the idea of the virgin birth of Jesus because it has no problem with that. It's saying that, and even says that Jesus did all of these miracles at his hands, um, but it was by the permission of God. So the story is we can accept these as long as we understand that it's only by the permission of God and not by independent power or agency of Jesus. And then saying that, look, these past prophets also had these miracles, and this is how we understand Jesus. So I do think that the Quran is embracing that aspect. But that doesn't answer the question of do I believe in miracles?
Right.
Um, But that's a deeper question. I think from a traditional perspective, from a Muslim perspective, miracles are problematic because if you read the Quran, it becomes clear that the Prophet Muhammad didn't do miracles in the sense that we think of miracles as breaking the rule or the rules of nature.
Yeah.
And the reason we know that is because there are multiple passages in which he's challenged to produce miracles, and the Quran responds to this challenge. And when you read it, it's pretty certain that he didn't do the miracles. Otherwise, it would have said he did these miracles. So now the traditionalist approach has been, the Ash'ari approach has been to say, and by the way, early on, Muslims were attacked for this very point because Christians said, your Prophet Muhammad is not a true prophet because he didn't do miracles. So how did the tradition respond to this? The tradition responded by generating miracle stories for the Prophet Muhammad and ascribing them to him and saying, no, he did do miracles and therefore he was a true prophet. But that's not convincing because all of those miracle stories are found out. Now, there's certain verses that they allude to and say, yeah, they're not very convincing. For example, the splitting of the moon. It's not too terribly convincing if you look at the Quran itself. So what they did was they generated these miracle stories and said, there you go. But the problem is they also then said that their saints can do miracles as well. Their awliya can do miracles. Now, they just called them karamat instead. They used a different term, but it's pretty much the exact same thing. In fact, they believe that the Dajjal can do, or the Antichrist can do what we would consider to be miracles. They're breaking the rules of nature. And in fact, certain Mu'tazili scholars, the Islamic rationalists, recognized this inconsistency and said, you've actually destroyed the very reason for having miracles. And so they said, I think the Mu'tazili idea made more sense. They limited miracles to prophetic figures and said, this is actually what distinguishes prophets from non-prophets. Now, I don't actually agree with that idea because, like I said, the Quran itself says that the Prophet Muhammad didn't do miracles. So I think from a theological perspective, Muslims have strong reasons to take the Quranic description of past miracles in the Quran to be allegorical, because that solves the problem of why the Prophet Muhammad didn't do miracles, as opposed to having to generate these later reports and say the Prophet did it, and then also believing that the saints do it. Then you've kind of defeated the whole purpose of it. But this is a long discussion. All I would say is I have strong theological, religious reasons for denying miracles and understanding them allegorically. And yes, academics use the term mythical, but this is not understood in the sense of being false, as the lay people think today. Mythical just means that it's not literally true. It's not literally science or history, but there's a deeper theological purpose behind what's being conveyed. So that's what I would say there.